Okay, well, hello everybody. I think we're right at about 2 o'clock, so we'll give it a minute or two for some other people to possibly be logging on to join us today. In the meantime, I believe that we have a poll that we wanted to put up, just to poll the audience. So Kimber, I don't know if you want to put that up for now, and we'll let people answer it for the next couple of minutes as they come online. I'll give it till 2 minutes after. That way anybody who's running a few minutes late has a few minutes extra time. All right, well, it's 2 minutes after, so I guess we'll go ahead and kind of get ourselves started here as people are joining. So I am Laura Picariello. I'm the fisheries specialist with Texas Sea Grant. And as a fisheries specialist, my role is to work with fisheries on sustainability challenges and continuing to improve U.S. fisheries. So, we work on everything from working with fishermen on gear designs to working with managers on better understanding fish populations. And so today we're just going to talk a little bit about, what sustainable seafood is. What does that mean? We hear about it a lot in the marketplace. We hear about it a lot in conversation. And so just giving you a little overview at a very high level of kind of what that means, and, here to answer some questions for you if you have any on what makes seafood sustainable and how to find it. So, let's see. There we go. So sustainability is a word we hear often. We hear it in all sorts of aspects of our lives these days. And, a very standard definition of sustainability, you see a lot of things thrown out there, like this Venn diagram on the right here with your 3 circles, in the middle is sustainable. But basically the concept of sustainability is making sure that something can be continued on and on without diminishing or decreasing. So able to exist constantly, or using resources in a way that we're not depleting or damaging them. But what does that mean when we're talking about fisheries? What does that mean when we're talking about sustainable seafood? And how do we decide that? Is a question a lot of people ask. And, seafood is a shared resource. It is a public resource. Unlike most of the food that we eat, which is grown or raised on farms or ranches, or often grown in controlled environments, a lot of the seafood that we eat is still harvested in the wild from shared public resources. And so keeping track of how we use that resource and how it's managed is a really important part of making sure that we're operating sustainably. The organization in the US, the agency that manages fisheries at the federal level, is NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. And NOAA defines sustainable seafood as fish and shellfish caught for human consumption by fishermen operating under sustainable fisheries management systems that conserve fish stocks and the ecosystems that support them. That's a mouthful, though, and so we're going to unpack that a little bit and just talk about what that actually means and some of the things that we look for. So There's a kind of a checklist that we go through when we're looking at what makes seafood sustainable. And here are the couple of factors, and we're going to go through each of these. Population size is a really important factor. Is it stable? Is it a population that's continuing to maintain or grow? Does the fishery impact habitat or the environment that it's in by its actions? Does it catch other species that might be affected by the fishing activity? And is the management system and enforcement effective in how we manage that fishery? And is it economically viable at that point, which is an important part of sustainability also. So we're just going to take a look at each one of these as we go. So the first one, is the population sustainable? Or stable? Yeah, there are a lot of questions that go along with this. If you see this nice picture here of the ocean, you take a look at that, it's really hard to count fish because you can't actually see them, right? There's a famous fish biologist who has been quoted as saying, counting fish is like counting trees, except they're invisible and they move around a lot. So just knowing the basic status of a fish population can often be very challenging. We have to use a lot of different types of techniques just to be able to understand how many fish are out there. But we also need to know a lot of information about each of the species we're trying to manage too, to understand how we can harvest them sustainably. So we need to know how long they live. If a fish lives until 50 years and we harvest all the fish when they're 1 and 2 years old, that's not a very healthy way of managing that population, right? Where it lives. If we understand different habitats that fish are living in, that helps us to better count them and better understand what the full population looks like. And we really need to understand, how that fish reproduces, how often, how many. Some species like sharks may produce only 1 or 2 or a few offspring a year, whereas other fish are, what we call broadcast spawners that release thousands to millions of eggs in a year. And so how much a fish actually reproduces is a big factor in how much we can harvest that fish. So there's a lot that goes into just understanding the population of the fish that we're trying to sustain to start off with. But that's not where sustainability ends for fisheries. We also need to take into account that we're operating in an environment that may have may have sensitive habitats, may have some things that we need to be careful and protect. So understanding where a fishery is operating, is it operating in our bay system? Is it operating way out offshore in the ocean? Is it operating near coral reefs or things that, we want to protect. And that also means that we need to understand what kind of gear we're using. Because different species are caught with different types of gear. So, some fisheries are trap fisheries, and traps sit on the bottom of the ocean. So thinking about where those traps are being placed, we don't want to go throwing some traps all over coral reefs or seagrass habitats that might damage them while we're trying to catch fish. But most trap fisheries actually occur in sandy bottom or muddy bottom areas, similar to fish trawls. We have a diagram here of a fish trawl that's operating on the bottom of the ocean. And so if we're dragging something on the bottom of the ocean, we've got to be careful about what else is down there, and making sure that we're not interacting with other pieces of the habitat that we don't want to catch. Whereas other fish species live in the water column higher up. And so you can drag a net through the water column without touching the bottom, and you're not interacting with the habitat at all. So understanding how your gear operates is a really important element of understanding how you might affect the habitat and how you might be able to minimize interacting with habitats that we need to protect. The third element that goes into thinking about seafood sustainability has to do with whether or not we're catching other species. There's a lot of creatures that live in the ocean, and they don't all live in separate singular communities amongst themselves, right? There's a lot of areas where we have multiple species that are living and interacting in the same environments. And so if we're targeting one type of species, it's very possible, depending on the type of gear that we're using, that we may encounter and catch other species along with that. And those other species are called bycatch, or it's the catch that is unintentionally caught when you're targeting another species. And we want to try to minimize catching species that are not wanted as much as possible, to make sure that our environment as a whole and our food system and the ecosystem are sustainable and not just the population of fish that we're trying to catch. So, some things that we need to consider about that are they protected species? In the US, we have a lot of species that are on the endangered species list or other protections. So for example, as we see here in this picture, sea turtles are an endangered species. In the US, their populations were in significant decline, and there were very serious concerns. And so as an endangered species, we have very specific protections for sea turtles and making sure that we don't damage sea turtle populations. Also, in the US, we have something called the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which protects marine mammals like dolphins, sea lions, and other mammals that live in the ocean that can often interact with fisheries very regularly. So we need to be aware of when we're interacting with those types of species particularly. And we need to think about ways that we can design and use our gear so that, can we exclude those species from the harvest? So for the example in the picture here, that's a turtle that's actually escaping from something called a turtle excluder device. And that net is designed specifically for that little trapdoor system that allows a turtle to come out of the net and not be caught with the rest of the catch. And in some cases, like trap fisheries, you can catch species that are also able to live in that trap for a while. And when they're harvested, you can actually go ahead and return them to the water safely, if it's not part of your targeted catch. So there's a lot of different things to think about in terms of the other species that we're interacting with when we are out in this wild environment that we're harvesting fish from. And of course, once we understand the science, once we understand where the fishery happens and how it operates, we can create rules around making sure that we are protecting and sustaining the populations associated with that fishery. But it's really important that we have an effective management system and that we have an effective enforcement system. So part of what goes into sustainable seafood and how we determine sustainable seafood is understanding who manages the fishery, if fishermen are following the rules, and if there's enforcement to make sure that that's actually happening. A lot of fisheries happen very far offshore, and so you can't necessarily see them from land. And so it is important to have enforcement activity that's able to have eyes on what's happening on the water. There's globally, there's a lot of illegal and unregulated fishing that happens, and that damages the sustainability of those fisheries. It also creates unfair market advantages and other challenges for fisheries that are doing things legally and sustainably. So it's important to have those enforcement elements in place to make sure that the rules are being followed. So in the US, we absolutely manage our fisheries sustainably. We have both federal and state management agencies that require that US fisheries meet all of these sustainable practices. And so we legally are required to avoid overfishing in our fisheries in the US. We're required to minimize any habitat impacts that gear may have on in the water when it's operating. We also are required to minimize bycatch and interactions with protected species. And so we have a very robust fisheries management system here in the United States that is a sustainable system built on the foundations of fisheries sustainability that we're talking about here. So in the US, NOAA actually manages over 500 fish stocks. So if you think about all of those things we just talked about and understanding, the characteristics of that species, right? Its biology, its life history, where it lives, how long it lives, how many of them there are out there, and the gear types associated with it. That's a lot to manage for 500 different types of seafood species. So it's a lot of work that goes into fisheries management in the US. And we are globally recognized in the US as being some of the best managed fisheries in the world. So the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations does evaluate and rank fisheries management across the globe. And the US always ranks very highly as one of the best managed fisheries because we do place such an emphasis on the sustainability of our fisheries here in the US. But there is another component, the last component that doesn't always get mentioned as much, that ties into sustainable seafood, and that is it economically viable also, right? So we can't have fisheries without fishermen. And, it's really important to be able to maintain our domestic fisheries, but that can be a big challenge when you think about the cost of operations that go into a lot of the practices to make sure that our fisheries are sustainable. We spend a lot of effort and energy on regulating our fisheries to manage populations, to advancing gear technology, which increases costs in how our fisheries operate and are managed. And that is, unfortunately, the reality is that increases the price to consumers when they're at the end market of having to sell that product for a price and not come out at a loss. And so sustainability for fisheries really also needs to include some of the economic challenges, some of the market competition from seafood that's coming in from other places that maybe are perhaps not using the same rules or following the same sustainability practices. And so from a financial perspective, they may actually have an advantage. And so that's something that needs to be considered a lot when you're thinking about your sustainable seafood choices as well. So how can you support sustainable seafood? One of the most important things is really knowing where your seafood comes from. If you know where your seafood comes from and you can understand the importance of how that seafood has been harvested or managed, then you can be confident that you're supporting a sustainable seafood source. So one of the most common recommendations is to buy US or local seafood. Unfortunately, in the US, over almost 70% of the seafood that we eat in the United States is imported from other countries. And so sometimes it can be a challenge knowing where your seafood comes from, but it's worth the extra effort to take a look and figure it out. There are some really good benefits to buying local and domestic seafood. Supporting strong US management and sustainable harvests that helps our environment, that helps our oceans, because that US management is upholding sustainable practices. You're supporting your local economy and your workers and your coastal communities, and you're reducing carbon footprints as well because you're not purchasing seafood that's been shipped from halfway across the world. So there are a lot of benefits to thinking about where your seafood comes from and supporting your local sources of seafood. Where can you find it? There's a lot of different ways, especially if you live along a coast or near a coast. It's great to be able to buy from fishermen directly. Many fishermen in the US are able to actually sell their products right from their dock. Most fishermen that do this have licenses, they have dealers' licenses, and they're able to sell fresh products under those licenses. So know who you're buying from, ask them if they're licensed as a dealer, but a lot of places, go to your local docks, get to know your fishermen, talk to them if you can. And it's some of the freshest place to get local seafood. Buying from a local or a small fish market is also a really great place to think about purchasing seafood. Fish markets typically have a lot more variety of local seafood products because they are sourcing from local fishermen, and typically that product hasn't traveled as far. And so it is a great way of kind of narrowing down and trying to focus on local sources of seafood. And if you're on the coast or you can get to a coast, it's really great opportunity to go fishing for yourself. It's fun. It's a cool experience. As a recreational fisherman, you are also still under management that makes sure that recreational fisheries management is sustainable as well. And sometimes you have access to species like here in Texas, red drum and spotted sea trout that you can't actually get from a wild harvest from commercial fishermen because they're off limits. So always a great option and a fun way of finding some local seafood as well. But if you're buying seafood at the grocery store, and the reality is most of us are because that's where we do most of our shopping, there are a lot of ways now to think about and find where your store is getting their seafood from. So sustainability has become a big conversation, particularly for sustainable seafood, and most major grocery retail stores now actually have either sustainable seafood policies on their websites, or even in some cases lists of their specific seafood product source and where they're sourcing those products from. So one of our local grocery chains here in Texas, HEB, has a full website for sustainable seafood, and it actually lists, as you can see on here, the species that they carry in their store, and it will tell you the country that they're sourcing that seafood from. It'll tell you whether it's wild or whether it's farmed or aquaculture fish. It'll tell you what gear type it's being used, and it'll tell you if it has any sort of sustainability ratings, or if it's a state managed program, or if it's got some type of a certification associated with it, so it has an independent verification of sustainability. Similarly, there's a program called the Ocean Disclosure Project that many retailers are now participating in, and Walmart and Aldi are just two examples of stores that participate in the Ocean Disclosure Project. And the goal of the Ocean Disclosure Project is to identify sources of seafood and whether or not they're coming from sustainably managed areas as well. So if you look at similarly the Ocean Disclosure page for Walmart, you'll see, for example, here, they carry blue crab from the Gulf of Mexico. And they tell you what type of gear it was caught with, which in this case was traps. And it also tells you that this is a certified fishery, which means that it has an independent verification of sustainability as well. And it gives you a management status, which in this case is well managed, and it is a US product. So a lot of stores are revealing this information much more transparently than used to be the case. And that information can be found before you even start shopping in a lot of circumstances, if you go and check your store's policy or their sourcing list. But if you're in the store and you decide you want to buy some seafood, the most important thing that you can do is check the label. Now, there's some warnings about checking labels for seafood. A brand name does not actually tell you where seafood comes from. And a lot of companies have caught on to that if they're importing seafood into the US, and they may use names that sound American or have American in the title or have a local name that may be recognized to give you the impression that it is in fact a domestic product, when that's not necessarily the case. However, in the US, we do have a law, the US COOL law, which is a country of origin labeling requirement. And products that come from outside of the US are required to list the product of origin on their label. So this is often hidden information and not easy to find. So as you see in the picture here, typically you're going to find it where the ingredients list is on the back of the package, underneath the nutritional information for the product. So we see in this case that it's a wild caught product from China. And so country of origin labeling actually does require, for seafood specifically, for the label to include both whether or not it was wild caught or farm raised, as well as what country it comes from. So you can always check the back of the label and find that information. Some other ways that would be really, that are great to try to stick with US seafood if you can, are to diversify. I think I mentioned earlier when we were talking about US management of fisheries that we manage over 500 fish stocks in the US. That's 500 different fish species that we actually harvest from US waters. However, 80% of the seafood that we eat in the US is made up of only 10 species. And the top 3 of those species are shrimp, salmon, and tuna. But we have a lot of seafood that comes from our local waters that is excellent to eat and highly nutritious. And so, think about looking for other common species, and some of the other common species in the Gulf, and specifically here in Texas, black drum, southern flounder, different types of snappers. I know everyone loves red snapper in the Gulf, but there are a lot of other snappers that we catch, like vermilion and lane snapper. And just be adventurous. Try some triggerfish or a tilefish. And if you go to a local fish market, they'll tell you a lot more about each of those species and what their difference is and what their taste profiles are like. But in Texas in 2017, we landed 93 million pounds of seafood, and that was composed of over 50 different species that we landed here. So there are a lot of options if you're willing to get creative and try some different things. But the reality is that you're not always going to be able to find local or domestic seafood. There are a lot of challenges to finding local seafood. As our fisheries have grown over time, as our rules and regulations have changed over time, we actually have much smaller fleets than we used to have. And so we have fewer boats and some more aging fleets at this point. We have fewer docks, and our availability of US seafood can sometimes be limited. It is also increased in operational costs. And so sometimes that means that when you see local seafood in your food market, it might be more expensive. It also means that a lot of times your local seafood is being directed to very high value markets in big cities, expensive restaurants, areas that may not be as accessible to everybody all the time. And so you may not always be able to access local products, or you may not, be able to deal with the cost increase associated with that. So there are some ways that you can actually investigate seafood sustainability that are coming from products that are not from the US as well. And how do you do that? The best way to do that, unless you want to get into a lot of research about how different countries manage their fisheries and how they operate, is to look for things like sustainability certifications that are going to do all that work for you already. So there are several independent programs, nonprofits and private labels that independently assess all the things that we talked about that are involved in sustainable seafood, making sure that populations are healthy, making sure that no habitats are impacted negatively, making sure that there's not excessive bycatch in fisheries. And so some of those you'll see in the grocery store are the Marine Stewardship Council, the little blue check. Alaska has a responsible fisheries management certification, as we do here in the Gulf from the Ottawa Nature Institute program. And there are several that are also associated with aquaculture, to make sure that aquaculture operations are also sustainable. So there is ASC, and there's the BAP is Best Aquaculture Practices, and Global Gap are these are some of the labels that you might see in the store. And what these third-party labels mean is that this specific product came directly from a fishery that was assessed by a third party and evaluated for all of these factors. And those fisheries have to be evaluated and audited annually to make sure that they're continuing to maintain those requirements. And if you go to that certification's website, those reports and all of the information about that fishery are public documents. So you can verify that, these are sustainable fisheries that are following specific practices if you want to go the extra mile and look to see the details. So if you can't buy US, looking for a sustainability label is a good option. With that, I'm gonna kind of wrap it up for now and see if anybody has any questions or things that they want to ask about sustainability or where to find local seafood. So we'll open it up, see if anybody's got questions.
Thank you, Laura. While we answer questions, we'll have our last poll pop up, and we would be appreciative if y'all could answer that.
Okay, sounds great. And I'm just going to move further so that way you all have my contact information. All
right, well, I have a question. You mentioned how often those certified fisheries outside of the US are evaluated. How often are American fisheries evaluated?
So third-party certifications like that, there are US fisheries that also have third-party certifications. It is voluntary, and a lot of US fisheries, because we have such robust management, don't always need to prove to their buyers that they are sustainable in the same way that buyers may ask other countries to do so. So it is optional for US fisheries to go through a third-party certification, but there are probably about 50 fisheries in the US that are certified. US management is ongoing, and fisheries are evaluated in the US. Depending on the fishery, there are stock assessments are done at different intervals and levels that are based on the biology of the species. So there's not necessarily a stock assessment that's done every year, but fisheries are under continuous assessment and evaluation in the US to make sure that they are sustainable.
Awesome. And we have time for a couple other questions if anybody has any. All right. I'm not seeing any more questions come through, Laura, so I'll let you close it out.
All right, well, my contact information is here. So if anybody has any questions at all, please feel free to reach out to me at any time. I'm happy to share some information. And thank you for taking the time to join us today and hear a bit about sustainable seafood in the US. And I believe, Kimber, correct me if I'm wrong, but this actually was recorded. So there will be a recording of it available online if we want to go back and check any of the information if I talked too fast, as I sometimes tend to do. So thanks, everybody. Really appreciate you joining us today.
And thank you, Laura.